just wanted to say thank you for for IFTI organizing this webinar, and for, of course, welcoming Mr. Treillet. I think it's very interesting to think about what will happen after this COVID-19 outbreak, and to see how it will change the public policies. And I want to say something about the role that banks are having in this energy transition, because we are part of this energy transition. And Crédit Agricole, to name it, has been one of the leading banks in terms of sustainable finance. I think this is very important because it's a tool to make things happen. And this market of sustainable, social, green bonds is growing very fast. And just to tell you that we are accompanying what is going on these days, because just to talk about March, we have issued social bonds for instance, in China for $4 billion with the Bank of China. With IFC 1 billion social bond, COVID, it's related to the COVID crisis, of course, and a $3 billion bond also with the African Development Bank. Just to say that we have these tools. We're making a relationship between the investors and the public sector in order to support what will happen after this crisis. So I just wanted to mention that because it's one element of this global picture, but I think finance has a role to play, and that's why we are very keen to be involved in what will happen after this crisis. So this being said, I know that we have Sophie Collet here. I will let the floor to Sophie Collet, maybe to introduce what Sciences Po is doing in India, and to start the discussion.
Sophie, sorry, yes. Sumit here. I see the ambassador is now on video, and he just joined. I guess he must have had some technical issues. Maybe if we can just welcome him, Ambassador Médecin. Can you put your video on, and so we can just welcome you once? Perfect, great. We can see you. Thank you. We just got through the welcome remarks and the introduction, and I am very glad that you're joining us, Ambassador Médecin. I know how important this subject is for you, as well as for and your support to the chamber, and we're all very happy to have Professor here with us. So if you'd like to say a few words, otherwise I can pass it back to Sophie at Sciences Po to take it forward.
I am a little late, sorry, I had a technical problem. I just don't want to interfere and lose time for other people, so I am very glad to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sophie, back to you.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. First of all, thank you, Sumit, Payal, Bruno, Tracy, all the team at IFTI for organizing this with us. I just wanted to tell you a few words about Sciences Po before introducing Dr. Treillet today. So as you probably know, Sciences Po is a leading university for social sciences. This year, we are actually ranked the second best university in the world for politics and international relations by QS rankings. And we are also known, of course, because all the last French presidents graduated from Sciences Po. That's like the university very much in a nutshell. Since the COVID crisis, the Sciences Po has been closed since the beginning of the lockdown in France on March 17th. So all our activities have been transferred online. The students are now studying and taking their exams online because it's actually exam time now. And we are also very thankful to our academic community because they reacted very fast to produce research on the COVID crisis from a social science angle. So today, I'm glad to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sébastien Treillet. Dr. Sébastien Treyer is a professor at Sciences Po, and he's also the executive director of IDRI, which is a research institute on sustainable development and international relations. He is a specialist in foresight for public policies and international negotiations on sustainable development. And today, he will allow us to reflect on what could change after the COVID crisis, focusing on sustainable development, public policies, and wider changes in our societies. So thank you so much to everyone for being here. And thank you very much, Dr. Treyer, for accepting our invitation. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
My microphone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I just need to try and share my screen, but no, this is not the one I wanted to share with you. I'm sorry. And I'm going to try and make it, I'm still struggling with the technicalities. I'm sorry. I think I'm going to be able to do it better this way. Sorry for this technical problem. I hope you see my screen and that my voice is clear. Is that the case? Can you hear me?
We can hear you clearly. We cannot see your screen yet. It's a blank screen at the moment.
Okay.
Perfect. We can see it now.
Yes. Oh, that's great.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is it still the case? Because I needed to. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see you.
Thank you very much.
We can see you. We can see the screen perfectly.
Thank you very much. So I'm really thrilled to have this occasion and very honored to be speaking in front of such an audience. I'm a professor at Sciences Po working on how to integrate the very comprehensive issues, I mean, the very problematic issues of our times about sustainability, trying to have that present in all components of Sciences Po. I believe that's what the students in France are telling us, that they want to be able to look at all the types of profession that they can have in the future through the lens of what the Anthropocene, the planetary boundaries, all these concepts that are very relevant for the ecological transition, how this needs to be integrated in all of their curricula. That does not mean that they don't need to have technical capacities or sectorial capacities, but I think it's a crucial moment for a social science university as Sciences Po. The other thing that I wanted to tell you is that, of course, I'm not going to be telling you what could I say, answers to what's happening today, but rather trying to tell you to make a kind of a testimony how a think tank that I'm heading in France called IDRI, how we as a think tank based at Sciences Po in Paris, working on sustainability already for 20 years, how we see a changing political landscape and also what are the demands of societies. Is there a political space for more sustainability? I believe the conversation we had just at the beginning of the conference was really around that. Many citizens here in India as well as in France are really very much shocked, in the good sense of being shocked, by the clean air that we have or the clean waters that we have. At the same time, is that really a political window of opportunity for more capacity to transition towards sustainability? This is the type of questions that I wanted to discuss with you as an introduction to this conversation. Just a few elements to also tell you the strange type of object that I'm the director of in Paris. It's called IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. As there are many francophone colleagues here, c'est l'Institut du Développement Durable et des Relations Internationales. But one of the things, we were founded 20 years ago by Laurence Tubiana, who has then been the ambassador for climate for France, head of COP21. And so what we do, we could be a kind of a very much smaller, but kind of a little cousin of TERI, the Energy and Resource Institute in Delhi. because we do the same type of policy analysis to try and influence international negotiations on global public goods, but also national transitions towards more sustainability being embedded in the private company strategies and public policies. One element that I think is important, which I will also explain from where I'm speaking, is that we work in coalitions of think tanks, particularly in Europe, with German, Swedish, Spanish, Italian, and also British colleagues to try and inform what can be decided at a European scale, particularly in the European Union institutions, on domestic policies like the common agricultural policy, but also on development policies and international action and diplomacy of the Union. Because we believe, and that's I think is something that we share with the Indian context, that if you want to have a federal level action, you need to be also very well embedded in the member state level the political discussions, and this is something that we believe is very important, and we are doing on the Green Deal in Europe. We also work globally in initiatives that enable us to have structural collaboration and conversations with think tanks in major economies of the world, and as I said, we work in a quite good partnership with Terry in Delhi, but also with the Professor Shukla from Ahmedabad Indian Institute of Management, on an initiative that we call Deep Decarbonization Pathways, which is about how can we make more concrete and tangible steps towards radical transformation of our economies, towards carbon neutrality before the end of the century. So that's where I'm speaking from, and we've been quite involved in international negotiations and European policies. What I think is important now is a little bit of how we approach a crisis while we are still in it. I understand that the situation that we have in Paris is now a little bit ahead of what you were telling me about the situation in Delhi. We are in a moment where the peak seems to be over, but we are preparing for getting out again next Monday, but we know that a second wave might be coming. So there are still a lot of uncertainties. And so my first point is to say we propose as a sustainability think tank to have three main principles of approach of what we can do in the crisis. First, being very modest about what we don't know, and thus being very precautionary, because the crisis that we're experiencing is unprecedented. And by that I mean that we can't really use any of the references of former crisis, economic crisis, as the ones that will explain what's going to happen to our economies or what are the nature of the responses that are needed. No responses from the past can be just transferred to today. And that means also that we sustainability think tanks need also to re-examine the solutions that we had proposed before the crisis, even if they still seem particularly relevant. I think we will be very much, it will be very badly perceived by political movements or trade unions if we just try to sell again the same ideas that we had before the crisis, without a thorough re-examination of the relevance of what we propose for getting out of the crisis. At the same time, the second principle is to say we know we need to be modest, but we also need to act very rapidly. I mean, the social distress, the loss of jobs are huge, and thus massive emergency decisions need to be taken and are already being taken. And thus, if we want to be sure that we can orientate those decisions towards sustainability, we need to ask fast, because there might be both a risk of path dependency if we decide to really invest a lot of our capacity of investments in Europe in sectors that are not going to be very sustainable, but that we invest in infrastructures that are going to be there for decades. That's a risk of being locked into an unsustainability pathway. And at the same time, we know also that the money is going to be scarce. The proposal by the European Commission is to use, or let's say even by Chancellor Merkel from Germany, she says we are okay to use much more of the 7 years European budget in the first years to come, and to focus that on recovery. That means that the decisions that are being taken in the next month or next year are going to be critical, because after that, we will have much less capacity to invest. If this is because what we see in Europe, and I will come back to that, is that the response now is for the moment a lot about bailouts and investment programs. And so what the third principle is to say, we should be very prudent about not trying to just sell again our sustainability solutions as if the crisis had not changed anything to the context. But at the same time, I think from our examination, sustainability, the Agenda 2030 of Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, climate neutrality, biodiversity protection, these commitments to the longer term are still, and much more even than before, very valid as long-term horizons of where we need to be. But what needs to be re-examined is maybe the pathway to get there needs to be different because of the levels of debt that are going to be there, because of the tremendous issues of jobs. So we completely agree with the UN Secretary General to say what we need to look at is trying to see how we can build back better. We completely agree that actually Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement, the protection of biodiversity are very important because we need to be looking at the capacity to tackle the root causes of vulnerabilities. And that's a very important part of the discussions that we need to have. It is true that some things that seemed impossible, changing the different sectors of the economy or imposing a pause on some parts of the economy, appears to be possible, or what we do in our individual lifestyles and behaviors. But at the same time, on that type of statements, we are very reluctant to say that shows that we can just transition from scratch from one day to the other to something very different, because the brutal consequences for employments and the social situations of many of our most vulnerable people is very worrying. So yes, some things that appeared impossible might be now thinkable or debatable, but then make them possible is still a matter of how we transition to that. And yes, I think if you hear, for instance, the French president, our political and economic doctrines that seem to be necessary might be questioned and revised. The way we fund public services in France, for instance, might be again a question because of what we see from the health public service. The President Macron, who was elected as an economic liberal about liberalization and privatization of public services, he's now much more trying to say everything is open. After the crisis, we might need to re-examine a lot of the political and economic doctrines that we had. But that to me, we need to be also very cautious about seeing if this is not just an epiphenomenon and to what extent this is a trend. And what I think we say is, yes, the need to protect our global public goods is now completely obvious, but we need to be also very cautious about the geopolitics of the moment. And so to some extent, this is my next slide, what we try to do at IDRI is to think in terms of Realpolitik. What is actually the political situation going to be when we exit the crisis? Sustainability and the transition to sustainability makes a lot of sense. There might be more demand, more social demand for a clean environment, as I said, but this is probably not exactly what people will be asking for because of the vulnerability and the social distress of what will have happened. And so I want to stress more than sustainability, the basic things that I think do matter is that we have lost a lot of confidence in institutions, particularly in France, I think, compared to other member states of the European Union. The distrust, the mistrust of the government is very high currently. And so we need to examine to what extent, when citizens are asking for more security, protection, there have been failures in governance of our economic systems, in private companies, but particularly our failures in the governance of our public systems, in alert, prevention, and in dealing. So you're not seeing my slides changing. That's worrying me, and I don't know how I can do that. Is that better now?
We still see the same one.
Oh, I'm sorry. So there is something that maybe I should. Le partage d'écran est en pause. Is it better this way?
No. Yes, we
No?
can see another slide. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes, we can see the next slide. Yes.
Okay, I'm very sorry. And if I change it this way, do you see it change?
Yes, we see a change now.
Okay, I'm very sorry not to be able to better manage my
That's it.
sharing screen function. So basically, I was still in the. I need to go a little bit faster, but I was just still in I think very important preliminary remarks. My first remark was to say we need to have principles of prudent thinking, but also acting very rapidly to try and orientate what the exit crisis strategies are going to be. And at the same time, we need to be also very cautious about what is the political demand from the populations. They are about vulnerability. I mean, in Europe, we have experience with the peak in crisis and what happens in our hospitals. A feeling of essential vulnerability of people, which is a kind of experiential learning that nobody would have wished for European citizens, but that brings a notion of what I think some people, some other people, populations in other countries, I think of least developed countries, experience on an everyday basis. That is something quite uncommon for the last decades in Europe, and that changes a lot the notion of the fact that vulnerability matters a lot, and that we need to have, as the President of France has expressed it, security, protection, sovereignty. So in terms of social demand and its interpretation by the political offer, this is also something that we need to reflect, what we can be building as analytical proposals behind this political offer. That means we need protection, we need sovereignty, because I believe it would be also very damageable if that just translates into more nationalism or isolation in terms of national boundaries within Europe, but also globally. But there is something that we need to hear behind the notion of the need for protection, the need for security, and the need for sovereignty. And particularly, I think we also need to put into our understanding first the issues of inequalities and employment. And third, of course, the idea that we need to build back better in terms of environmental sustainability. So I think we at IDRI, we are always keen on seeing that there is a need for more sustainability if we want to avoid new crises, that there is a need for European scale action if we want to be efficient, that there is a need for international cooperation. But this is not completely, I think, not completely obvious in the public debate in France. Many people are asking for that, but there is also a lot of people who are really worried about being much more worried about their security at a much more local scale. And there is I think a last point that I think is very important in terms of how the political debate is emerging from the crisis. The role of science is particularly, I would say, shaken from the crisis in France, but in other countries, and we see that in a very worrying context in the USA. But in France, for instance, the government has been working with a council of scientific advisors that to some extent exposed a lot the scientists in a position of being the advisors to the policymaker, and sometimes being the ones who should take the decision instead of the policymakers. This is not exactly how that has happened in France, but to some extent it's putting a lot of emphasis on the role of scientists in a very classical way, meaning the advisors to the government. And I think we need to be worried. For those of you who have been for a long time involved in sustainability issues, we can understand that the role of science alerting on climate change and now trying to propose solutions was not just being the advisors to the government, but also the advisors to civil society, acting with local authorities, co-constructing, co-designing solutions with businesses and local authorities. So this, I think we had been in working on climate change solutions, biodiversity solutions, we had been experiencing a much more vivid relationship between science and the whole of society than the very classical position of the scientists speaking truth to power that we have seen in the media because of the health crisis. And I think we need to be cautious that puts a lot of emphasis on that science will be one of the key players in the democratic debate in Europe after the crisis, but in a position that is much more classical and much less constructed with the society. And at the same time, science is also one of the key assets at the international scale because it's acted as a global community and really science as a global commons. And so we need to really be cautious of protecting the role of science and making it understandable that they are not going to be responsible for the failures of political action, even if they have try to give the best advice possible, and that we need to be cautious also about the global global science community as one of the assets that we have for tomorrow. So I will then go through 4 types of issues that I think are worth mentioning. First, the health crisis. My first point is on the links between the health crisis and environmental degradation. I think this is something that we need to really put the emphasis on. And that is really something quite different from discussing about the possibility to green recovery plans, which is going to be my second point. I think there is really a discussion that needs to be had, because science was already clear for decades beyond the current crisis and before the current crisis that there is an increased risk of pandemics linked to biodiversity degradation, and not just the trade of wild animals, but also deforestation and the industrial livestock production that was at stake with the H1N1 outbreak in Mexico in 2009. So I think we have here a moment where the discussion between environmental degradation and health has a lot of political capacity to be regarded as something that does matter, both in what we do in our national action and how we can better cooperate globally. Of course, we need a diagnosis on what has happened on the alert and prevention systems, what has failed, what has functioned also, and the issue of timing and transparency is particularly key. And we need to, I think, revive our understanding of the idea that we need to look at one health, that there is only one health between the health of ecosystems, the health of our animal production systems, and the health of our human populations. That was a concept that was really pushed in the beginning of the years 2010, but we need to also get much further in the capacity of to organize globally and at national scale our science systems, our evaluation, detection, and alert systems. And the World Health Organization is one key element, but also the World Organization of Animal Health. And what we also can do in terms of prevention, that then links a lot with the idea that we need to protect biodiversity by being much better understanding how we can change the pathway of our industrial livestock production systems and how we can avoid deforestation and also other types of degradation of biodiversity. This is a key element of the political debate that needs to happen. It's very strategic and contentious between China and the rest of the world. So it's a very strategic geopolitical playground, but I think this is a moment where the EU and China can be having a dialogue on how to be objective and more cooperative on tackling these root causes of such kind of pandemics. So this was my first point, and I think that's something that we at IDRI we are working on. My second point is about the economic and social crisis, and how what are the types of exit strategies and how that can be related to more sustainability. And this is really one of the areas where I think we have lots of uncertainties. We have uncertainties about the nature of the crisis. Which reference can be useful? Is it more something like the end of the First World War, the end of the Second World War, the crisis of the Great Depression, or the mobilization of the economy for the war by Roosevelt? Should we use the Green Deal, the New Deal Roosevelt, or the Roosevelt of 1940? What can we learn from the crisis in 2008? So I think a lot of questions are there on the table about this crisis, and economics as a discipline needs to be very precautionary in the way it analyzes the crisis, because this is a crisis where the shock is both on supply and demand, because we might be experiencing a chronically unstable regime in economics, where the crisis exit might be much more in a W shape or W's shapes, or a crisis with ups and downs for a long period of time. And so I think we cannot use exactly one of the solutions that were developed for the former crisis, but I believe that the idea of reconstruction that is used by UN Secretary General Guterres or by Spain Prime Minister Sanchez, saying that we are in a period where what we need to think about is reconstruction. I think that seems quite relevant as a motto. As I said, we need also to be careful about the fact that we are in a moment where we see as if we only had a very brutal switch. Either we have our economic growth, employment, and social welfare on one hand, or we can switch the whole of that, the economy, but then we also switch off a lot of our social welfare and we have environmental quality. And this is something I think that opens up a big stream of work for think tanks and for companies and for governments about how we could really make it real that we have welfare, social welfare, that we have employment and well-being for people, and maybe through growth or opening up the idea of prosperity with less growth. But that for the moment, we need growth to have social well-being. And if we only have that brutal switch, that's not good news for being able to be more sustainable. So this is really a long-term issue. I want to put the emphasis on the fact that the nature of the crisis is also quite uncertain. The nature of the response to the crisis is also very, very uncertain. We see that there is a lot of state intervention. So state interventionism after the crisis is of course more than ever accepted. But to some extent, that opens up a question about, is there going to be a shift in the paradigm of how we see the importance of government intervention in the economy? I'm quite unsure about that. I believe in terms of how to regulate and organize public services, this is going to be a debate that will last after exiting the crisis. There is also something that appears to be very important. It's the role and place of system-relevant workers, as they are called now. Those who are in first place now and who are actually the less well-paid in Europe. And so there is a discussion about how we could redistribute, about fiscal redistribution, but also about remuneration levels. And there are questions also about resilience, organizing, for instance, our trade exchanges to be more resilient, and there is a big discussion in Europe about relocalization. All of this is, to me, very uncertain in how it will really unfold in the future. What I think we can see is that there are going to be high levels of debts, probably also high levels of savings, and so that means that the Keynesian response about investment programs for the recovery might not be the only way to look at the solutions, and that there might be a place for central banks interventions. And of course, the IMF is also a very important player because of the very high levels of debt in many of the countries, in the developed, the emerging, and also the least developed countries. And so that this was just to me to say, a lot of what we see as responses is about investment plans, bailouts and investment plans as a way to have Keynesian recovery plans for the economy. I still think we need to be very cautious about the fact that there might be other things that we need to think of in terms of intervention, monetary policies, or other types of interventions that might be necessary. In terms of the economic recovery, I think one important thing was to say, in the New Deal, one lesson that I think was very important is that there was these 3 time horizons of relief, urgent relief, recovery, exit strategy in terms of a stimulus package for recovery, and then a 3rd horizon that is about reforming our fiscal redistribution system, the new social contract, or also the transformation of our economies, for instance, towards sustainability. And the idea is not to have that we need to have a sequential management of these 3 horizons. We need to have a simultaneous management of these horizons, but it's not the same if we think of relief instruments, recovery instruments, and reform instruments. The problem is that what we experience in France is that the sequence of crisis will be such that it will prevent a clear distinction between these 3 horizons, and what we will experience is a series of emergency plans that might prevent us of having a clear discussion about what to do for the longer term future, which is our sustainability long-term horizon. So we have a lot of discussions about how, of course, it's going to be, it would be very complicated to try and put conditionality to relief instruments when it's about helping the health system or keeping people in their employment with public money, paying their unemployment money, there is no conditionality to that, and I think that's clear. Then comes the question: if we put conditionality to the bailout of an aviation company like Air France, how could we have conditionalities on that? And I think this is where generally people say, yes, employment first. If you want to put conditionality on us in order to say you need to change your business model, we can't requalify our workforce from one day to the other. So yes, for conditionalities, but it's about conditionality on our long-term sustainability strategy. And that opens up a lot of discussion on what can be those long-term commitments, because we are experienced to the fact that long-term commitments for a company are not that easy to hold when you have lots of other uncertainties of the midterm economic future of the economy. So the three horizons are blurred. There is nevertheless one comparison to 2008 that I think is useful, because we had the same type of recovery plans in 2008, even if the crisis was with a different nature. But compared to 2008, renewable energies, for instance, are cheaper. Green technologies are cheaper. We have much better understanding of what is brown and what is green. I think the colleague from Emeric from Crédit Agricole was showing to what extent we had in Europe a taxonomy. We have in China a green finance standards that show that you can much better identify which projects are aligned with sustainability and those that are not. The political balance, at least in Europe, is also much more in favor of trying to put more emphasis on green recovery plans. But what is at stake, I believe, is the fact that the problem of green recovery projects is that there might not be as rapid in delivery as other projects. And we have economists in France that are discussing that building renovation to have better energy efficiency in existing building is a very wonderful win-win solutions for social and environmental purposes. But there might be a problem in the rapid delivery of that type of plans. So maybe this is where we should try and see how to position those types of projects, not necessarily in early recovery, but in a long-term sustained recovery that will matter, because it takes more time to implement. And compared to 2008, another point that I think is useful to mention is that after 2008, the long-term horizon was the one that was lacking most in what was done with the recovery plans. And so this is the one on which we need to insist. And if I look at the EU situation, I think what we have is currently much better than I would have expected one month ago. There has been political courage of the president of the European Commission, of 18 ministers, I think now, from different countries, including Spain, Italy, and France, that are badly hit by the health crisis and the social distress, that are supporting the Green Deal, the transition in Europe, the transformation of the economies of our whole continent towards sustainability, that this is the plan and that we need to keep that as the horizon. But at the same time, we see some governments, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also some sectors that are saying, please, maybe we should try and be less ambitious on the environmental part if we want the economy to be better. So the political moment is still quite unclear, and what we are trying to look at for the moment is to see how we could inject in the in the recovery plans green projects with a high level of low qualification jobs. And I think that's a question that is very important in all economies over the world, particularly where there is a lot of informality. And that's a big question mark on which I don't have a lot of answers. But I think in tourism, in catering, and in the restoration of ecosystems and agri-food, we have here elements that would be good for being green and for being offering employment. So what we are working on with other colleagues in Europe is to try and see how we could assess recovery plans. There is a governance issue there. It's not just about injecting a lot of green in the recovery plans, but being sure that we can construct these recovery plans with the citizens in a democratic way, and assessing to what extent they are really good for the social and equity question, for the resilience question, for the cohesion between territory. Is it fair that the European recovery plan might be more directed to Italy and Spain than to Poland? I believe it is fair, but this is something that needs to be assessed independently. That it's transformative for sustainability, that the recovery plans, that they are transformative for sustainability, and that they are at scale. So this issue of political governance is key, and I believe this is something where it's always useful for Europe to be able to think of how a federal country like India might be looking at the same type of issues, because we share, I mean, the federal nature of decision making, that is not, of course, something that we share with China. Nevertheless, and I think I will have to be much more rapid on some other parts of my presentation, but I think on the economic part, that might be something that you are particularly interested in. We believe that we in Europe have a lot to discuss with China in particular, because they are ahead of the crisis. They have emerged from the crisis to some extent. And what they will do, because of the magnitude of their market, is also very important. And the fact that for the moment, the position of the Chinese government is to say we need to use the crisis to make a new step in modernizing the Chinese economy. And the buzzword is new infrastructures, which are not completely all favorable to per se to the transition to sustainability, but to some extent that can reduce the content of fossil energy and coal in the recovery plans that are going to exist in China. This new infrastructures is something that we should try and see how we can coordinate the recovery plans between large economic regions in the world. And of course, China, India, and the EU matter if we want to look at global climate action, because these are the three major economic blocks that were committed to sustainability and particularly climate action. I will not go into many details, but of course, we are very worried also about the situation of emerging countries, particularly when they are oil dependent, when there are lots of informal economy, and least developed countries like Africa. But the situation in Africa is for the moment very unclear about the health impacts of the pandemics. What we know is the social impact of the lockdown. And so we have argued that there is a lot of emphasis to be given in Europe, not only to support with public money the reconstruction in Europe, but also a strong partnership with Africa. And I could come back to that. Maybe, sorry, I had planned to tell you three other things, and I'm going to be very quick on that so that there might be some time for exchanges. I think we have we see it, the opening up of a conversation with businesses about resilience, precaution, system scale risks, but also system relevant workers. And we have seen lots of businesses in Europe trying to look at, shouldn't we have a new design of business strategies where the issue of resilience, of redundancy, of diversification, not just in our suppliers or supply chains, but even in the way we design our value creation, the way we deal with what we produce, what is the function of the company in the society, that might be something that changes the business strategies, because we believe that there is a rationale in favor of that, because of the possibility of a chronically unstable economic regime that has to shake not only risk assessment but the strategies of businesses in their industrial organization. Of course, this is much more affordable as a thinking for large-scale transnational companies than for SMEs, but we believe this is something that is important. We don't know if this type of reflection might not be just an epiphenomenon, but we believe in the capacity of the financial sector to really ask drastically the questions of risks, about systemic risk, about the risks of the pandemics, that really would put much more emphasis on resilience and diversification issues that are actually potential triggers for a sustainability transition in some sectors, and in particular, I believe in the agri-food sector. And that might also change at some moment the material footprint of globalization. I'm quite unsure about the fact that it's being resilient is not just sourcing locally, but some more reliance on sourcing locally might be a good resilience strategy. And that's, I think, is even is as important as discussing politically, should we open or shut down our trade negotiations. I think the material organization of logistics and supply chains by companies is something that might be changing, that we might be discussing and looking at. I had a lot of issues also about what the crisis does to our lifestyles and our well-being priorities. I think I'm being already too long and I want to finish at noon on time. But I think it's important to look at the fact that there are lots of things that might be changing in our lifestyles, but still consumption in Europe at least is at the heart of our growth strategy. So it's not going to be possible from one day to the other to switch off consumption drastically. But to some extent, we believe that in our lifestyles, there is the issue of sufficiency in food, in energy, the controlling demand is something that is becoming acceptable. And it's also a lot about putting more solidarity in the way we look at our lifestyles and our consumption patterns. So in mobility, we see that in mobility, we see that in food, we see that in the possibility to rapidly change our social practices. But one thing I think is important mentioning, we believe also that this is going to be very important to have as a democratic debate, rather than trying to see that we could decide on lifestyles and behaviors from a top-down perspective. As there are going to be lots of discussions on what is the political model that enables to deal with such crises, I believe big democracies like India or the European Union need to really put the emphasis on the fact that if we need to use the crisis to reflect on our lifestyles, then this is about a democratic debate about what needs to and can be done in terms of changing what determines our lifestyles, which is not just determined by public authorities. And the last slide that I had was really about taking a step back to international cooperation, where we need to be both looking at the fact that cooperation is badly needed, as I said, on global public goods, environmental public goods, but also public health and financial stability. The G20 is already having a lot of good signs, which I had not expected under the presidency of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Good signs on green recovery plans that are mentioned in the last communique of the G20. And I think there are lots of issues also to be discussed on debt relief and state aid, etc., where that opens up both very necessary discussions between the EU and China, but also very complicated discussions between the EU and China. On debt relief, it's important because suddenly a discussion has to be held on how Chinese investments in Africa, for instance, have been increasing the debt of governments, and how we can jointly deal with debt relief in a way that is positive for those countries and for sustainability. The same on state aid. There will have been massive state aid in many countries around the world. We need to have a concerted discussion between China and the EU on trade and investments. And so I have here a list of things that will matter in terms of discussions between Europe and China. There is also a lot of mistrust between EU and China, the way China has been bragging about helping Italy, Serbia, etc., has been considered an interference in domestic affairs of the European Union. And at the same time, the way Europe is intervening also on what needs to be made transparent on the outbreak of the crisis in China is also considered an interference in Chinese affairs by Europeans. So this is a complicated moment, but we believe that this is a strategic moment for a conversation to be held in the context of global fragmentation and fragmentation even of the EU. But because I'm talking to Indian colleagues, I think this is there is a big moment on the EU-China relationship. But we've advocated a lot at IDRI to really try and open up those conversations and not make them a bilateral discussion between Europe and China. We believe that, for instance, if we want to be ambitious on climate action, we need to open the discussion to India, EU, and China. We need also to be able to look at what Latin Americans are trying to make of this crisis because of the way that they are so dependent on extractive models of growth and export-oriented models of growth. Canada and Japan are also asking for their capacity, are also showing their capacity to be leaders or champions of multilateralism, and we need to play also with them. So what we ask for is to be very cautious about the dialogue between Europe and China, but also really think of distributed leadership. The world of tomorrow, with the US being structurally isolating, that would be my guess, is important to be thought of not just as a new superpower being China, or a couple of superpowers, or willing to be superpowers, Europe and China, but really a situation where we need to be looking for distributed leadership. And in that context, being able to exchange between Europe and China, including, I really want to say that we need to build new coalitions that include other actors, and particularly transnational companies. So this is a place where you at IFCI and your members are going to play a very important role. I hope I have not been too long, and that we have still some time for questions. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have received a few questions. The first one, the member would like to remain anonymous. In the slide of green recovery, you have mentioned that China is in position to move ahead. What if all EU companies leave China and set their offices in Asia or EU? What is your take on replacing of Chinese green finance standards and replacing with EU or other green finance standards? You are on mute at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. I'm not very well positioned in my room in Paris, confined for more than 2 months now, to really assess what's happening in China and the European companies in China. I believe that the person from the audience is right to say that there is a tendency in European businesses to try and reassess the dependency on Chinese suppliers, or on the Chinese market as an output for the company. But I don't see any rational move by any of these European companies to really try and get out of China. Well, I understand from the question that the idea would be to say, why not? This might be a trigger for those companies to try and diversify their relationships with Asian economies, and that I think might be making sense. The other part of the question is on finance standards. Last December, before the crisis outbreak, I had very interest of trying to establish we had very interesting conversations, convergence of sustainability standards in the financial sector between the European scale so-called taxonomy of what is a sustainable investment and the green finance standards in China. And we believe that this is something that is, this is not to say that the Chinese economy is green or that the European economy is green, but the efforts of discriminating, being able to distinguish what is aligned with the transition towards sustainability and what is not, is something that is being discussed both in China and in Europe, and you believe that this is a stronghold of the financial sector that might be very useful. That does not mean that it excludes other economies from participating to that, but I believe we don't see the same type of dynamism, for instance, in the US financial sector, which is of course worrying to us because they are extremely powerful financial players. But I think there is something to be organized in the convergence of sustainability standards between Asia and Europe, including, of course, I would include India.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from Yasmina Clouvelier. What are the point of views of youth, news generations, associations, and civil societies on all topics you are presenting? How are these stakeholders involved in these reflections?
Thank you very much for this question. I believe it's complicated to really be sure about the public opinion in general. But as you say, and that's not your question. You're asking about the organized civil society and youth movements. I will nevertheless try to say something, because a Spanish colleague of us, they have been at Real Instituto Elcano, a think tank based in Madrid. They have been doing a survey in the population, and interestingly, a lot of the population was really worried about their priorities were first security, protection in terms of health and employment, and second, environmental sustainability. So the idea that we need to build back a greener world is still very present in a country like Spain that has been really struck by the magnitude of the health crisis and the way that they have seen their elders die to an extent that they had not imagined before. So a society that has been so shocked as Spain is still thinking, when you look at polls, that sustainability matters. And so that the idea that we need to build back better is something that is there in the opinion. What I was trying to say is that we have a strong mobilization of civil society, youth movements, even trade unions that are saying we need to recover from the crisis and we need to use public intervention money to make the situation better for companies and for those who are employed by these companies. But we need to keep in the long-term horizon the issue of social and environmental sustainability. So that is very strong in Europe. Nevertheless, what I was trying to say with my few slides on the green recovery is that we need to be very cautious about the fact that to get out of the crisis, small restaurants, SMEs, in the variety of sectors, but even large companies like the automotive, aviation industry are going to ask for help, and they cannot, from one day to the other, transition to sustainability. So that's a moment where the mobilization of civil society is going to be very important to be able to keep with the long-term horizon, while at the same time we try to negotiate as much as possible things that are sensible with the companies to be sure that they can recover from the crisis economically, but that they take the right direction. And when they invest, then they invest in infrastructures that are aligned with the sustainability transition.
Thank you for that. There's another question from Arul Kumar. Can countries come together under the aegis of UN and develop a cross-nation compliance audits on sustainability without a veto power and strict enforcement?
This is a very interesting question, and this is really the type of thing that I wanted to look at with my last slide. I think the first part of my answer is to say, yes, we need. If we look at the status of the planet, of the economic needs of the planet and the environmental boundaries of our planet, we would badly need a capacity to assess globally and not just at the EU scale, as I was mentioning in my presentation, the alignment of recovery plans with sustainability, with the Agenda 2030, with the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, not just environmental sustainability, but also social sustainability. So that would be very important. And I think I agree with the question, with the person asking the question, that this is what we need to aim for, to be able to have coordination between nations of the world on being aligned, on aligning the recovery plans or the economic responses to the crisis with Agenda 2030. Then the geopolitical situation is complicated, and the capacity of the UN to host that type of discussion is, I believe, quite complicated because of the very nature of UN conversations, where there is no peer review of what another country is doing. So one of the things that I see emerging, but that seems quite utopian for the moment, is the idea that it might be a moment to renew the Bretton Woods institution, and in particular the IMF. We will be living in a world with very high levels of private savings and very high levels of public and private debt at the same time. So this might be a moment where we need a financial institution to be revamped, reorganized with a new mandate, to be able to look at debt relief and align them with debt relief for governments and align them as much as possible with the sustainability objectives, to look at solutions to mobilize private savings for the investments that are needed without increasing too much public debt. And so that's, I think, there is a maturity of a political moment where we might be looking for a country that would be the champion of opening up such a discussion. It's very risky. It might not be happening, but this is a critical moment where it might happen. And this is where I was saying, if it's only France going out, that's of course going to be so French, where we try to think that we have the best ideas in the world, and that's not going to happen. We have already experienced a lot of diplomatic failures when France tries to go isolated. And it's not just an issue of trying to have Europe and China, but still, I believe that China and Germany are countries that have overcome the crisis to some extent. They have still a lot of economic and financial capacity. And if those two countries that are completely not similar because of the size, very different sizes of the countries, but these two countries might be leading up something about our financial reform at the global scale. So you might think that I'm a little bit too a utopian by saying so, but I believe there might be a moment where these ideas could be and should be pushed. And this is where we necessarily need not just two champions, but also a coalition of players, including companies, including civil society, and including countries like, I think Japan has been proposing last week in Germany at the Petersberg Dialogue on Climate Action, that we should have a joint capacity to assess the alignment of recovery plans with climate action, for instance. And I think those types of suggestions by a country like Japan, or the way that Canada might be looking at it, are things that we need to harvest in order to push for a moment of a big step in global cooperation. But as I said, Realpolitik is also very important, and we might fail. But there is a window for opportunity.
Thank you for this. Another question from Mr. Mohammad Rizwan. He's from Ultramarine and Pigments Chemical Industries. He works as a safety officer. His question is there any acts, rules and regulations, guidelines, or any government mandatory norms being framed like Factory Act or OSHA industry guidelines, ES or IS standards, etc., so that we can follow the standards and monitor frequently with legal compliance, which the topics based now on sustainability, development, policies, and changes in society?
I must confess that I'm not completely aware of many of the types of norms that are mentioned in this question. So I hope I'm not going to be relevant in my answer. The main point that I would like to stress is that in the operation of companies, I have seen in my career of 20 years working in this 20 to 25 years working in the area of sustainability, quite a thorough change from sustainability being something that you report on in a CSR, corporate social responsibility document that was actually not at the core of the operation of companies, something where the sustainability director is at the COMEX, he's present in the executive committee of the company, and he's defining not only adjustments to the company strategy, but the core of the company strategy. So I believe that beyond norms that I'm not aware of as norms that would be transversal to all sectors, there are norms of sustainability, but I believe what matters more to me is sector by sector, the way that private initiatives are trying to define the new normal of the business model and of the value creation of those companies in order to be sustainable. And of course, there are legal provisions in Europe, in India, also in China, to ensure that companies are operating without harming the environment and with also social standards in terms of labor, etc. And I think one of the key elements of the answer to this question is again to look at the financial sector. The weight and the importance of the environmental, social, and governance standards in finance, the weight of those assessments is, I believe, always stronger. And this is something that might be very important in terms of aligning the way sovereign funds are looking at their investment in specific companies, the way that asset managers are prescribing to some extent changes in the way companies operate in order to be much more aligned with sustainability standards. So I hope I'm not confusing or I'm not confused in what was the question.
Okay, we have another question from Yasmin. What do you think about the potential of hydrogen to transform our industries and improve environmental sustainability?
Thank you very much. This is a very specific question, but very important question. I think what is referred to is the idea that hydrogen would be the source of energy, changing from other types of energies. I think it's important to mention, and that was not, I mean, in the question that was probably already what Yasmin had in mind, that hydrogen is majoritarily a vehicle of energy. So you need to, hydrogen is a very efficient way that you could store power and reconvert hydrogen to power, to electricity, and back to storing in hydrogen. So to me, it's important to look at hydrogen not as a solution to substitute for fossil fuel, but as a very interesting way to complement the electrification of all our energy system, to shift from other types of energies to electricity, because through hydrogen we would be able to store energy in a much more efficient way than with the batteries that we have for the moment or at larger scale. So my point is to say, if we want to be sustainable, there are three pillars that we need to have. One pillar is to electrify our energy demand. The second pillar is to make our electricity production more renewable, more sustainable. And the third pillar is to reduce on the overall, or not reduce, but control the growth or reduce the growth of our energy demand, so demand management. So the three pillars are electrification of demand, reduction in demand, and greening the production of electricity. So you see that there is a lot of emphasis in these three pillars on being able to transition, to shift our energy demand to electricity. And for that to be possible, then hydrogen is going to play a key role, both for individual end users of power, like your housings, but also in companies where they use electricity to produce other goods. The idea that we could electrify and use hydrogen to better store electricity, that I think makes hydrogen a very important part of the equation. And I think it's important to understand that it's a critical part of the equation, but it's not the solution to all, because then we still need to discuss how we are very efficient in reducing our energy demand, to make our energy demand very efficient, to make it the minimum possible, and at the same time also how we are going to be able to substitute fossil fuel by other sources of energy, renewable energies, to produce electricity.
Thank you very much, Professor. These were all the questions that have been mentioned in the chat box. We'll give it 2 minutes more. We'll see if any more questions are coming up.
There was one in the chat that was asked to me, and I can maybe read it, because maybe you can't read it yourself. And so it reads out: would the short-term and urgency of focus on relief and recovery suck all energies and actually cause harm to the reform step? That's the first part of the question. The second part is how do politicians like Donald Trump, wielding enormous power, change from how do politicians like Donald Trump, wielding enormous power, change? How could they change from make America great to make the planet great? So on the first part of the questions, I think this is really our worry that the relief and recovery part would suck all energies, but also all the money available before we can jump into looking at the reform step. So what we try to install is that actually it should not be a sequence. We should think of the 3 times horizons, but manage them simultaneously. Meaning that, for instance, if we want to have reform orienting our societies towards less inequalities and more environmental sustainability, we need to set up norms and public policies to do so that are ambitions in the longer term and changes in our norms that give previsibility, foreseeability to the economic actors. If we know, for instance, that we are going to get out of diesel cars in Europe in 2040 or 2035 or 2030, that gives, this is a tremendous change, but this gives for foreseeability. And that type of policy making is going to be very important because it should orient the reform size and the recovery package also, because then companies would say, yes, my investment is not going to be so much in diesel cars, but I still need to use my work to give jobs to my workers who are in the automotive industry and not just transition to any other type of railway transportation. So the transition might be progressive, but if the policies, the norms, the regulations, and the progressive increased ambition in environmental regulations is set out clearly very early in the process, then I think we could manage jointly the horizons of recovery and reform. And that, I think, is what is trying to be done in Europe with the idea of the Green Deal. The Green Deal was both an investment program and a set of regulations and norms and setting really very ambitious, drastically ambitious environmental objectives in the longer term, being climate neutral in 2050, zero pollution, reduction of our material footprint and energy footprint by 70 or 80%. So the objectives set to 2050 were completely, absolutely extremely ambitious. And I think this was one of the good things of the Green Deal. And it also contained issues like that were already discussed before the crisis, like the climate law that was supposed to be a law at the scale of the European Union, saying how the Commission would be progressively increasing the ambition, for instance, in the emissions trading schemes on greenhouse gases emissions. So really giving previsibility, foreseeability to the increased ambition in environmental sustainability. This has to be continued. And for the moment, we see a problem in European affairs that a lot of those strategies, for instance, on biodiversity protection or on the agri-food farm-to-fork strategy, are for the moment being postponed as a political agenda item in the Parliament and in the Commission, because we have other things to do. But deciding on long-term objectives and mid-term objectives in terms of increased ambition of environmental standards, this is going to be key if we want to align the different horizon. I see that you have a problem in hearing me, and I'm very sorry for that, as I'm being very long in all my answers. Do you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
So the last question is about Donald Trump and how to try and push politicians like him to change towards from making their own country great to making the planet great. I have no solutions for that, and I think. I mean, not living in the US is really very complicated to understand how this very big and very important country with lots of intellectuals is now in a very big example of what a democracy can be when it functions well. This is a tremendous problem for us to see that such a democracy is now in a terrible problem of I would say the absence of a political leadership that would go in the right direction. So it's very complicated for me to see what would be the solution to push politicians like Donald Trump in the right direction. What I think is the best way to in Europe, I would say, for instance, to counter-argument the Polish or the Czech government who are saying we need to isolate, we need to put the emphasis on just economic growth and not environmental sustainability. The argument that I'm using is to say, look at South Korea, look at China. They're already doing the next step ahead in modernization, which is getting green. I'm not sure this is completely true for China. I'm not sure this is even completely true for South Korea. But I think this is an argument when you can say, we don't want to be the laggards. We don't want to lose another step in globalization. So we need to see that already a lot of the countries that are emerging from the health crisis are taking the sustainability road. And they're wanting, and those countries are to some extent implementing it, and to some extent really serious and sincere when they say that we need to do that in a cooperative manner globally. And so I think that's the argument that I would use, but it's you see, it's a rhetorical argument, because to some extent, all I say is not completely, it's a bet about the future that I'm talking about. But this is the type of bet that I would offer a politician from Eastern Europe, saying, you'd better be on board with our Green Deal, because else you're going to lose not only the votes of some part of your civil society that is asking for that, but you're also going to lose the economic race with Asian countries.
We have another question. With the oil price going down, will electric vehicles be slow to become mainstream? This is a question by Ajokant Ruya.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is something that I had no time to look at in particular, which is the strange coincidence. I mean, the not strange, but the synchronicity of even before the crisis, the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, leading to very low prices of oil. And this, of course, has been reinforced by the slowdown in demand for oil and gas because of the lockdown of the economy. And this is very complicated to understand what are going to be the consequences for the oil and gas industry and for other economic sectors like the automotive industry, and I think that was the question. I just want to I think it's very important to look at the fact that the oil and gas industry is in a very complicated moment because of the impacts of the low prices in this market, and some of the I think what I think we need to be the indication that I take as very interesting is an indication from the financial sector. I think a lot of the financial sectors are now saying, don't invest in oil companies. Oil not only is in a bad situation, oil companies are not only in a bad situation now, but these are going to be stranded assets for the future. So I'm not, again, it's a lot about prognosis that are very fragile. So I don't want to say that I know what is going to happen, but I have the sense that there is a sense of history changing that is currently changing in the financial sector, even more than after 2015 and the Paris Agreement, etc. That is going to consider that fossil fuel is definitely not a good asset to invest in, and it's rather going to be a stranded asset. I think that's something that we need to look at. Then, when I come to the exact sector that the question was about, namely the automotive industry, then it's a little bit more complicated, because it is true that for the moment, for citizens, it's going to be much more, it will not make a lot of sense to invest in an electric car when they're going to buy a new car, or when they need to change their cars, because for the moment, operating with oil is going to be much cheaper for them. So this is why, for the moment, the whole discussion, and I'm again speaking from Europe, and it's complicated to extrapolate from one specific region to another. I think the sense is to say we need to give economic signals to the fact that oil for cars is not the future, And we might try to use the low prices in oil for the moment on the oil market to increase the carbon tax that we have, for instance, had in France, and that led to the yellow vest movement because people said we could not afford oil. So why not use the moment in a low in the oil market to try and give more economic signals and increase the tax on carbon in order to ensure that electric cars are not seen as less interesting than fossil fuel cars. So that's a discussion that is very tricky because socially it's going to be very complicated to install that, but that's the type of thing that might be needed. In the longer run, nevertheless, the good thing about the Green Deal in Europe is that I believe that we have now still a very active conversation with the automotive industry in Germany, Spain, Czech Republic, Italy, France, about what is the future. In what should you invest? Should you continue investing in electric vehicles? The answer is yes. That's the direction that the von der Leyen Commission at the European Commission is giving, saying we don't change the horizon. If you don't want to have stranded assets, the horizon is that we need to switch to more electric vehicles, and we are going to organize innovation funding, public innovation funding. We are going to organize infrastructure investments in order to make that the new normal. And even in France, I must confess that the Minister for Transportation and Ecology, Madame Borne, she's both the Minister for the Environment and the Minister for Transportation, she was really saying it would make no sense for me now to say to the automotive industry that they could drop all the efforts that they had been doing on trying to transition towards electric vehicle just because of the crisis. So we need, as public authorities, to give the direction of history. That's our point, because this is how we can give foreseeability to businesses and thus also be confident about what are the jobs that we are going to be able to build for the future.
Thank you so much, Professor. These were all the questions that we received. I will now hand over the platform to Bruno to do the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Professor Treyer, for this really inspiring and enlightening presentation, and also for opening our eyes on this important topic, sustainability in these trying times. I would also like to thank our organizing committee, Sophie and Dia from Sciences Po, Tracy and Pranita from IFKI, who have worked very hard to organize this webinar and make it a success. Merci everyone for your participation, and hope to see you very soon in our next webinar. Meanwhile, stay safe and wishing you a great day ahead. See you very soon. Bye.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure answering your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bruno. Thank you, Professor.